Afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life. And we thank you again for making these Tuesday conversations a part of your day. Today, Bishop Rogness will be sharing his own observations about what being in the office of the bishop looks like and what those who will do the electing should be thinking about. And then he'll plan to use the first half of this time for his presentation and then turn the group into breakout sessions for discussion, coming together for a few minutes at the end. So as ever, throughout the hour, feel free to write your comments in the chat area, your questions as you think of them, and he will address those as possible throughout the hour. Also a note, as ever, we are recording this webinar for those who are unable to make it today. And of course, if you want to go back to reference anything later on. You'll find the recordings on the Synod's website under webinars. So let's open with a word of prayer. Generous God, we thank you for the abundance of your rain these last few days. Our cornfields and gardens bring hope with their lush new growth, feeding our souls and bringing us joy during these otherwise gray times. As we enter the next weeks before our Synod Assembly, help us to be more intentional about praying for our bishop nominees and to be mindful of the abundance of ways that we have been given to get to know them better. Help us, Lord, to appreciate the importance of our work as we strive to elect a leader who will serve us as your humble servant while fulfilling the duties of the office of the bishop. We ask this through your Son's holy name. Amen. Bishop Rogness, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Vicki. As always, thank you. I've commandeered this session instead of primarily conversational. This is going to be primarily presentation. I'm going to talk for probably a half hour. You're going to vote for a bishop in 4.5 weeks. You have done a lot of work in town hall meetings and conference discussions and in looking over the material that the 4 candidates have given. You'll vote, I won't vote, but unless Jan Enslin or George Carlson are on this Zoom meeting, frankly, I'm the only one here who's actually seen that office from the inside. So I wanted to offer some thoughts on that I thought might be good for you to look for in a bishop. So that's why I call this What I Know That I Think You Should Know. It's a glimpse inside the office from my being in that office for 29 years. Every talk should have a text, John 21:18. Someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not want to go. That's the verse. And it isn't meant to imply that it's a terrible thing serving in this office. It isn't. I speak of it as a privilege, and it is. It's a holy calling. God is at the other end of that belt that goes around your waist. But I use that text to explain in what follows that this office comes with a lot of givens and expectations. You don't get to choose whether you respond to them or not. You might be able to choose how to respond, but not whether. You unpack your boxes in this office, and this is what begins to unfold. So I'm going to talk about several points or several traits that would serve a bishop well. And in good Lutheran form, these traits, I'm doing it in pairs, kind of paradoxes. Each one stands alone, but it's kind of complex and fuller as they're paired together. 7 pairings I'm going to share with you. A holy number, 7. So here goes. The first one is authority and humility. Authority and humility. I'm going to start each one of these pairings with a snapshot. And the snapshot for this one actually comes from the life of this synod going back 35 years. On October 28th, 1985, I was elected that day in Madison as bishop of the Southern Wisconsin District of the American Lutheran Church. I drove home to Milwaukee at the end of the day, And at 10 o'clock at night, the phone rang, and the voice at the other end of the phone said, "I'm president of my congregation here in Beloit, and we just voted to fire our pastor. I understand we're supposed to let you know about these things." Off and running. 2 weeks later, I was in that congregation, meeting with their council and their pastor, and then again 4 weeks after that, working with them, working through how they were going to deal with this. If I had been 6 months earlier there as Pastor Peter Rogness of a small church on the north side of Milwaukee, they would have said, "Nice to see you, but would you mind leaving? We've got some important work to do." But I wasn't there as Pastor Peter Rogness from Hephatha Church in Milwaukee. I was the bishop. They probably didn't even know my name yet. I was the bishop. And the bishop's here, and the bishop means business. And now let's get serious about our business. For as much as we Lutherans like to aw shucks this lofty sounding office, the fact is the office itself does carry authority because the church needs it to carry authority. That church in Beloit needed that office to have authority, no matter who was in it. And whether it was me personally or someone there on my behalf, the authority centers around that which comes from the office of bishop. Now, the office doesn't carry a whole lot of actual legal authority because our Lutheran polity and structure doesn't allow for that kind of power. The bishop isn't a judge on a bench. It isn't a police officer carrying a badge, but there is real authority. It's both given, expected, and earned with time. In time, the people like those in Beloit who make the phone call have it in their minds that somehow, at that point in their life, turning to the authority of the bishop was a good thing. It may be, if that authority isn't worn well, they may conclude it's not a good thing. So here's the point. To whom do you want to give that authority? How do you want it to be exercised in a way that the bishop continues to earn it? How is it worn? I've come to think that the authority of the bishop has two components that are key. The first is wisdom, and it doesn't come from simply being a wise person all by yourself. You need a bishop who brings to the table something that you don't, some insight, some breadth of understanding of the life of the church, connectedness. Wisdom arises within someone who over the years sees and hears and listens and absorbs and integrates the church's complexity into his or her own being. That also means that in terms of the authority that's exercised in the life of the church, this authority represents, in a phrase that I've always loved to use, the accumulated wisdom of the church. What I bring isn't just my opinion. It's my awareness of the accumulated wisdom of the church. But the authority of the bishop should also arise out of and be practiced with humility, the second and key component to this notion of authority. It's easy for a bishop to think that serving as a bishop is a really big deal, that the church doesn't need somebody who's seduced by the title. You are the church. No, the church is the church. You're in one office that serves the church. The church needs someone who can wear that authority, that presence, the visibility in the office in a way that people feel comfortable drawing close, a humble kind of a presence. Those who feel, you want someone who feels what you feel, whose ego doesn't take up space in your world. So I'd wrap this up by posing this question that arises from this pairing. Who can best wear the authority that will come with the office? Who will bring both wisdom and especially humility to that authority? That's the first pairing. Second one, personal character and public presence. I don't really have a snapshot for this. It does occur to me that Reinhold Niebuhr, when he talked about the Bible and the Bible in one hand and newspaper in the other, was getting close. But this is sort of personal and public. I want to be led, I expect you do too, by a bishop whose character is deep and sound and trustworthy, whose spiritual life can be sensed by others, someone who is honest, not deceitful, who's going to be led by the needs of others and not by their own needs. I want someone whose personal life and home life is sound and well cared for. A good self-care needs to be in evidence. The Apostle Paul's gifts of the Spirit, kindness, compassion, patience, generosity, humility, I'd like all of those from my bishop. Firm convictions about these things, a firm sense of who one is fundamental. I want to be confident and proud of who they are as a person. But I, and I suspect you also want to have confidence that when the microphone is put in front of this person or the camera goes on, the bishop speaks on behalf of my faith, my convictions. The bishop is going to be a public figure, often called on to speak as your mouthpiece. It's going to be assumed the bishop speaks sort of for a larger body of the church. And if the bishop's voice is shrill or partisan or inarticulate, this public voice has the potential of just becoming one more noisy voice in the squalor of shrill debate, alienating people who don't agree. What the bishop says needs to be well informed, needs to be consistent with positions taken by the church, needs to be respectful of the views of others, but it needs to be rooted in the person's own character, a genuine concern for people, especially the poor and the marginalized. Not simply giving voice as a loud and arrogant voice, but with a zeal that rings true to the faith conviction that courses deep within who they are as a person and who we are as a church. So for these, you need to think about this question: whose public presence arises from the very heart of who she is as a person? Personal character and public presence. Okay, let's go to the third one with the longest snapshot of all. This one, I want to talk about heart and spine. And here's the snapshot that happened far more often than I wish it would have. A process has unfolded over several weeks or several months, maybe, that culminates with the pastor coming into my office, sitting in a chair, and I explained that a short time ago, allegations came to my attention of sexual misconduct. And I followed a process of investigation into the credibility and the substance of those allegations. I sought to determine if there were signs of other misconduct as well. I explained that the allegations have been put into a written complaint, a signed affidavit, and that if true, my responsibility for the oversight of the clergy roster calls on me to draw up formal discipline charges. I invite the pastor to respond or not respond at that moment, as the pastor may choose, but I do explain how the process unfolds. The possibility of a consultation panel or a discipline hearing or a resignation from the roster, all leading to disclosure in front of the congregation, or in some cases, past congregations as well. And as I'm doing that, as I explain the allegations and the process that will unfold, I'm aware that I am unalterably changing lives. Most probably, I'm dismantling a career. I'm throwing a congregation into turmoil. I am wounding families. I am also aware of what this means for others, myself, other Synod staff, as we seek to care for the victim, perhaps more than one victim, and families, care for the congregation that's thrown into trauma. You get the idea. There is nothing that causes such a deep ache in my heart and tightens my stomach and takes the spring out of my step like sexual misconduct. And what's worse, it sucks the life out of families and churches as well. I hate it. It's the worst part of this job. It's awful. And for the health of the church and for the protection of the integrity of the office of ministry, it has to be done. That's the snapshot. Now let's talk about the bishop's heart and the bishop's spine. Studies say that a common trait among those of us who are drawn into ministry, a trait that has both an upside and a downside, is the desire to please people. and receive the strokes that come from having pleased people. I recognize this trait in myself. I've got it in spades. I understand how it works to benefit the ministry that I do and how it can work at times against what I need to do. The upside of the trait means that people who want to please other people have good antenna for other people, empathy. We understand what makes them tick, where their heart resides, how they're likely to respond to things. A soft heart is a good thing. A needy heart is not such a good thing. It's a very good thing to have a heart that senses people's pain and uncertainty and longing and joy. A bishop, like a pastor, is often the one turned to when life issues hang in the balance, when cancer is found, a marriage falls apart, kids are jailed, ministry becomes too burdensome. The Synod Constitution leads off those pages of duties of describing a bishop's responsibility by referring to the bishop as the synod's pastor. You will need to think about that. Who is it that when things get hard, whether in your personal life or perhaps more commonly in your ministry as a pastor or a lay person leading a congregation, whose presence do you trust to call on? Who has the heart to join you in your struggle? The bishop needs a heart. But then come those times, like the snapshot I provided, when I begin a conversation with, I'll try and be as pastoral as I can in these matters, but I can't just be a pastor. You need to find someone who can. Or in dealing with a congregation, to begin to say things that perhaps people in the congregation may not want to hear. These are the other responsibilities that we put on the bishop, the roles that the church needs that person to play. You need a bishop to be clear enough about what the health of the whole church needs from her, so that you can count not only on the heart, but also on the spine. Of all the 7 pairings that I will talk about, this is the one that I think tears you in two. It pulls you apart in ways unimaginable, but they belong together, heart and spine. The strength of the spine has to be rooted in a conviction that when people's trust in the church and the integrity of its leaders is breached, when their very lives might be at stake, the bishop's role turns from pastor to protector, no matter how difficult that may be. This is a hard one, so ask yourself the question, who has within them both an understanding heart and a strong spine? Heart and spine. Let's go to number 4. I don't have a catchy title for this one. This one gets wordy, but you might understand what I mean. Sitting in your chair at the big tables and sitting in my chair at your tables. So here's what I mean by that. If you had walked into my office the last 12 years that when I served up in St. Paul for 12 years as bishop, the side chair next to my desk, it was inscribed with the emblem from Carthage College. It was a parting gift to me from that college for having spent 17 years on its board of regents. I was not a graduate of Carthage College, and I was not a big bucks donor. What I was bishop of the synod, where the college was located. The role of bishop puts you at a number of tables. You are one of 65 synod bishops, plus the presiding bishop and secretary, who form the Conference of Bishops, and there's a bunch of others. That conference of H. George Anderson, who was the presiding bishop of the ELCA from 1995 to 2001, when we were right in the midst of weathering the storms over call to common mission, the ecumenical tussle we were in, and the sexuality tensions that were arising. George Anderson said the Conference of Bishops became the most trusted table in the church because the bishops knew one another and shared a sense of stewarding the life of the whole church when they gathered, but they also knew you. Every one of the congregations and rostered leaders had a place in the church, had a place at that table. Every congregation had a place at that table because that bishop knew the people who had sent the bishop there. So when the conference of bishops gathered, you gathered, because the bishop sits in your chair in that room. That's your place. And being a bishop in that same way may also put you on boards of other kinds of places, church colleges, the Wisconsin Council of Churches, Lutheran Social Services, seminaries, all sorts of agencies, Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service. The list goes on and on. The opportunities to sit at these other tables come regularly. You have to sort of guard against jumping too far into that. But it's going to come. You're invited to meet and talk with mayors and governors and business leaders. You go to national offices. You are in senators and representatives' offices. All of this could have the effect of puffing up a bishop with self-importance. But the thing I always had to remember is that in any of those places, they frankly never wanted Peter Rogness at any of those tables. They wanted Bishop Rogness. And that bishop's presence at these tables and in these venues aren't of any value to them or to you unless that presence that's being expressed is your presence, unless the bishop embodies and expresses an accurate and articulate expression of who you are and who we are together in this place. And that means that it's important to you that the bishop recognizes the importance of being present at your tables and shows up, because the bishop is your proxy at the big table. That's your chair. If someone were to say, as I've often heard said, I wouldn't go to those kind of meetings, I'd be with my people. Well, think a bit about that, because while you do have to have some limits about saying yes to those things, you ought not so quickly give up those chairs, because those are chairs that belong to all of you. That's your presence. But the importance of the bishop's presence at those tables arises only because he or she is the one who is at your tables, at meetings of church councils and call committees. The bishop knows you, and the bishop is with you as pastor, which is what gives life and vitality to the bishop's presence at the other tables. So you need to ask yourself that kind of question. Who do you want to have as your presence in these places? Who will be familiar enough with the chairs at your tables that you can sense you will have a presence at the other tables she's at? Okay, let's go to number 5. Lutheran identity and interfaith engagement. Now here's a snapshot. I didn't much like this one either. I sat in a meeting with a mission director some years ago and 2 pastor developers, one whose congregation was really thriving and another whose congregation just languished. We hoped the one pastor could give some energy and vision and know-how to the other through this conversation. At one point, the pastor of that thriving congregation spoke about the urgency that he felt in connecting with other people. So we asked, tell us more about where that sense of urgency comes from. And he replied, we know salvation is offered by Jesus if we give our lives to him, and if we don't, we go to hell. We're in a battle for people's eternal souls. If we don't win, they all go to hell. Well, I admired his urgency, his passion, but his certainty and his way of articulating the gospel left me very uneasy. So here I want to talk about theology, the gospel, the heart of the church's proclamation, and the importance of the bishop being someone who's theologically grounded. Maybe I should have started with this. During the Reformation, when the early Lutheran church first came into being, they didn't even call them bishops to start with, superintendents, later bishops. They oversaw, they examined, and they approved the gospel proclamation of those who would serve as pastors. We still do that. It's called candidacy, actually, and other ways as well. But the theological and gospel-centered grounding of the bishop is important because that grounding of the whole church is important. The religious landscape today, I think, across the globe is increasingly divided in two poles, what I'd call the absolutists on one side and the relativists on the other. The absolutists, like the pastor in my snapshot, claim they have the truth and they can spot others who don't have the truth. This isn't just conservative Christianity. This cuts across all religions, Islam, Judaism, other sects. Absolutists put themselves in a superior position because they got God right. And in reaction to that, increasingly in this day and age, are the relativists, an increasing number who are so turned off by that judgmental religion. They see the excesses and the arrogance and the intolerance of religious zealots. They want nothing to do with it. So they're committed to tolerating everything. Any faith is the same as any other, so let's all just get along. Whatever you believe is fine. What I believe is fine. The bishop is your presence in the midst of that polarity, as we all find ourselves in the midst of that polarity. The bishop needs to see clearly that being Lutheran is an asset. We have a word of life to bring. We are a confessional church, and our bishops need to know that body of theology. It grounds us not in worship of doctrine, which is an error of our Lutheran history, but we are grounded in the centrality of the all-encompassing and all-embracing unconditional grace of God. And if God's grace is central, then our need to be the judge is gone. We can leave that into the hands of a graceful God. And because we are centered on a conviction that God's relationship with us and with the world is centered in this unconditional grace, we are positioned to be open to the possibility that God's vast love and grace may be reaching other people as well and find its way into the lives of others in God's created realm. In the faith traditions of other travelers, we are centered in an evangelical theology that positions us for this wider, life-giving engagement that enhances the lives of individuals and the whole community. The bishop is the one who assumes this posture and models it for all. So think about that as you think going forward. This question: who can model for you both being anchored in good Lutheran theology and in embracing the whole of God's family? Next one, number 6. Electing a person and being served by an office. A snapshot for this one. In typical years, pre-COVID years, spring assemblies would bring some elections of new bishops. And in July sometime, all of those newly elected synodical bishops arrive at the churchwide office for a kind of an orientation. They learn a lot about the churchwide organization, but the topics of these opening conversations that become topics in the actual orientation discussion as well, the topics that they connect with and they carry into over lunch and coffee and they start their animated conversations are these. What are the staffing decisions you've got to make? Are you going to use some old staff, some new staff? Are you shifting portfolios? How are your synod's finances? Do you have room for new possibilities, or are you tightening your belt? How are you going to arrange your time? Do you see yourself continuing the pattern of your predecessor, or are you going to establish some different priorities? Are you moving? How good's your vice president? How good's your executive committee and your synod council? All of those urgent topics, hardly any of them are the subject of forums and speeches that lead up to the election, but they're there front and center. I've been at a lot of bishop elections, both synod and churchwide, and I've been in several myself. I've heard a lot of speeches and lots of ideas and visions floating. Occasionally someone will say something about administration. And if it's along the lines of, it's important and I'm really good at it, you can almost sense the audience yawn. Often you hear, well, I know it's important, but it's not a priority for me and I'll find someone else to do it. And then there are fewer yawns. But after 30 years in the office, here's my take. You elect a person, but the expectations you have of that person are delivered not simply by one person, but by the office of the bishop, a collegium, a team of people who live out what you have elected to have happen in the person of the bishop. That means you elect essentially a head of staff, a chief executive officer. The work you elect a bishop to do is done by a number of people. And I think I'd go so far as to say that I've seen more bishops and synod ministries crippled by poor organization and administration than I have seen crippled by anything else. What this means is that amidst all of the duties and activities of the person you elect, pastoral, spiritual, public, teaching, worship, the person needs to take time to build and maintain an efficient, competent, skilled, committed group of people, staff and key leaders, and do the daily work of providing a platform from which they can do their work of serving you and the church well. It means being available to staff, being available to others, leading in the synod, and to support and provide the administrative connectivity that builds the whole. And beyond the staff, the synod as an organization needs an effective CEO to work with the governing board, to make sound decisions of all kinds. The buck stops here, and a lot of people need something from where the buck stops. Bishop can't just walk away from that or give short shrift to that basic administrative work. Bishop needs to bring the best administrative skills he or she can and provide for what else is needed beyond the level of his or her own capability. You have to keep this pairing in mind. You elect a person, but you are served by the office. It's the bishop who gives shape to the work of the office and the life of all that flows out of that office into the life of the church. It's a both and, but it all has to hang together. So the question that I put in front of you for this one, whom might you elect that will take seriously the ministry of administration? The ministry of administration. You elect a person, but you're served by an office. So finally, number 7, vision for the future and an understanding of the past. The snapshot could have arisen from any one of the assemblies, churchwide or synod Q&A sessions, a candidate forum, and candidates are asked, what's your vision for this synod? What's your vision for the church? If I had $1 for every bishop's election that asked the vision question, I'd be a bazillionaire. It's asked all the time. Why? Because vision is important. People are hungry for something beyond the familiar or the predictable. They're drawn to someone who can hold out hope of something new, a possibility that gets them unstuck, a common purpose that can help them see their own world in some new light. The bishop is someone who has a megaphone strapped to her mouth, and people notice what a bishop says. And articulating a vision can have the effect of creating common language and common focus for the church in this place. That's no small thing. But there's also the reality of who we are, of the church culture we're in, the realities of our church. The bishop, no matter how inspiring the vision, is not Joan of Arc, who sounded the charge and the army all took up arms and the townspeople took up arms to follow in Orleans, to follow her into battle. It doesn't work that way. Our reality is more like the bishop sounds the charge and the townspeople glance up and say, maybe. If they aren't saying bishop who or what's a bishop. The point is, vision doesn't mean soaring off into a fantasy world. Vision cannot create reality out of fantasy. The church we serve today didn't just appear last week. Every one of us sits in a place that we've inherited, a place with past, with traditions, with a church culture, a way of being church. If a bishop doesn't know that church culture and know how to operate in it, there's trouble ahead. The past has given us our current reality. Someone who doesn't understand that isn't well equipped to move us toward a future vision Those two need to be together. A vision unconnected with reality will only bring disappointment. But reality with no vision for what else is possible leaves life flat and barren. So you need to ask, who will both lift your vision and know your reality? Who will both lift your vision and know your reality? Well, those are my 7 traits, pairs of traits. Those are some things that I know, that I've experienced, that I thought could be helpful for you to know, or at least to think about, which is why I paired them each with some questions for you to think about. I used the verse introducing all of this from John 21. Someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. I use that verse to try and make clear that there are a lot of givens that come with the office, a lot of things that you, the church, needs from that office. You don't get elected and then get to decide what you want to do or not do. The church needs you as bishop. It's a servant office, here to serve the church, to serve all of you. A formidable call? Yes. Privilege? Certainly it's privilege. Sometimes the pits, sometimes the mountaintop. Always surprising, because the grace of God is found in unexpected places. On August 29, you will call someone new into this office, and the Lord of the church will tie a rope around her waist, and a new chapter will begin. So that's my glimpse from inside this office, some suggestions for what you might want to have in mind as you pray and listen and decide whom to call into this office. You have 4 good pastors in front of you. Pray and think and ponder, and then elect one of them, and God will make her a bishop. Now for the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to pop you into breakout groups to share some reactions to what I've talked about, what you've been thinking about as the election draws closer, what you're already beginning to sense about the possibilities before you. Have some conversation as we come back. We won't have a lot of time at the end, but as we come back together, post questions that have arisen in your groups in chat rooms. We may not get to many of them in the few minutes we have remaining here, but 2 weeks from now, we're going to come back to this subject. And I've enlisted 3 of my friends, former bishops, Mark Hansen, Andrea de Groot-Nesdal, and Stan Olsen, who will join me and share their perspectives on how a synod thinks about going towards an election of a bishop. So questions that arise, put them in the chat room, and we'll get back to it. But at this point, thanks for staying with us for this long. And Robin, why don't you go ahead and put them in chat rooms. All of it, and in case the thought occurred to you, so I wonder which one of our nominees he's talking about here. I should tell you that my starting point for working on this was actually in the fall of 2013, after nearly concluding 12 years in the St. Paul Area Synod, as they were getting ready to elect a new bishop. I did a presentation sort of on this order. So when the idea was, why don't you do this again? I went back and pulled that up and did some tweaking. It isn't just like it, but at any rate, the basis for this was on that body of work and didn't have anything to do with who these nominees are you have in front of you. As I said at the end, I think 4 fine pastors, elect one of them. So I just wanted to make sure that disclaimer was out there. Any observations or questions that arose from the groups you were in? You can either wave your hand and Robin or Ricky will spot you, or put something in the chat room as well. How can this recording be available? Do you want to explain that? Robin or Vicky, why don't, this will be available. It was recorded. And where would they find it?
Yep, you'll find the recording with all the other webinar recordings from this conversation with the bishop every Tuesday on the Synod website. I'll put it in the chat, and it's under webinars. So scsw-elca.org/webinars. And they're up there pretty quickly. Jason Zhang is our webmaster, and he typically gets them up in 24 hours.
Okay. There's a thing in the, oh, I don't know if I want to go here. Our group asked if each nominee could produce a 20-minute video that responds to your 7 points. What we ask nominees to go through, I think, is they have done an introductory video. They have done about a 10 or 12 page written piece. They have participated in 2 forums, and then responded to a bunch of written questions. They've done a whole lot of writing already. I might tell, Bishop Election Task Force meets next week, but and I'll share this question with them. I'd have to confess I'm a little hesitant on top of everything else that builds towards the assembly to ask that. They've responded to many questions already. But anyway, Nick, thanks for posting it. I'll pass it along to the task force. I don't see any others in the chat right now, and we are, I did recognize that by being so wordy through all of this, we wouldn't have much time for wrap up afterwards, and I did think that the breakout sessions would foster more engaged conversation than a group of 50. So, but give some thought to, let me just say a word about what I'm envisioning 2 weeks from now when I've invited Mark, Andrea, and Stan to be part of this conversation. I'll say it at the beginning of that one, but I can say it here as well. Why did I invite the 3 of them? Well, when I introduce them, you'll get some idea of how far back I go with every one of them. That's part of it. You just lean on your friends when you want to do something like this. But I also think it's significant. Every one of them has been a parish pastor, a synod bishop, and given leadership in the churchwide office in some form. And each one of them sort of understands the culture of Midwest Lutheranism. And I think all of that's important. So we'll have some fun with that conversation. But it would be even more fun if prior to that time, if there are particular questions that you would like to have them respond to. But then once we're into it, I'll invite them to do some opening comments, and I suspect they'll have some give and take among themselves. But we'll be inviting you to also comment and participate in the conversation in the chat room. And so we'll grab some of those comments as well and feed them into the larger discussion. We won't do breakout sessions in 2 weeks. We'll have enough voices going on with the 3 of them joining us at that point. So I don't see anything else being added to the chat, and I see that my watch says 3 o'clock. So we probably should bring it to a close. Vicki, announcements.
Sure.
It's all yours.
So just a Synod Assembly update for you. Tomorrow, our executive committee will be briefed on the recommendations for how we will execute our video conference assembly, and then you will begin receiving information. And you do need to continue to move forward with preparing your voting members for assembly. We will, of course, be leading those efforts with many helpful tools they can use to prepare for assembly, tools that not only address the technical aspects, but also the discernment of the matters for which they will cast their votes, including the spending plan, compensation guidelines, council positions, and of course, the bishop election. We do plan on holding a hearing in the evening for voting members the week before the assembly to learn about the spending plan and compensation guidelines and to give opportunity for interaction and questions. So they will have time to think about these things before the day of the assembly. And as ever, we will ask our roster to pay attention to our communications coming from the Synod office so that you're better able to walk with your voting members. We do encourage you to invite your voting members to the next webinar with Bishop Rogness, where he has invited these special guests to talk about the role of the bishop. So those are my final comments. Anything else, Bishop Rogness?
No, thank you for tuning into this and being a part of the life of this synod. Look forward to our conversation next week, where we'll return to what we've largely been talking about and sharing our own experiences and how we're coping in these very unusual times. So see you next week.
Thanks for attending this Equipping the Saints webinar. It's always better with you here. Have a great day.